Our final session of the day. We have Armon, who needs no introduction, but yeah, great to have you here, and thank you again for visiting and everything you've done here today. Grant Orchard, field CTO for APJ, so works across customers all over Asia Pacific and Japan, based here in Australia. So has been at the company for 4 years, or so 5 years, 4 years. Well, 5, yeah. So we'll hand over for a Q&A session, so please have your questions ready, and then after that we'll have our happy hour. So just a few questions to go. Thank you.
Just a few questions to go. No worries. All right. Well, I have to say, thanks for that last session. I can't see very well with the lights in my eyes. I will say that I'm never going to hear the word inspiring again and think in the same way quite about it. So thanks, James, for that one. So just kicking things off, I know this is a fairly quiet audience. There's not a lot of questions, so I am very ready for us just to have a chat here, but to start with, I think we've seen the evolution of this company over the years, and I've certainly watched your evolution as well. And I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen has been your sock game. So I would love to know who picks your socks. Do you get them from every country that you visit? And what is your selection criteria? They're HashiCorp socks. That's got a H on it.
They are. That's the evolution. Is really the brand evolution. Yeah, totally coincident. We had these were the HashiDays socks from London actually, and I was digging the design, so that's why I'm still wearing them.
Man, I feel like Khalees. What's going on? Do we have HashiDays socks for Sydney?
I think they weren't able to get them produced here in Australia for some reason. The swag producer couldn't handle them. But that's probably been the evolution. Most of my socks are just HashiCorp branded. So you have the original OG brand, and then when we went more black and white, and then the every variation in between, basically. So that's what drives it.
Awesome, love it. So on to, I guess, maybe something that the rest of the audience is probably a little more interested in. But you mentioned, you were in London, you're in Munich. I've sort of watched you downstairs today talking with various customers, and I'm really curious in terms of what do you see at a global level? Are there more similarities between our various geographies, or are there some real differences? Are there things that in terms of the conversations you've had today versus there that are worth highlighting?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting and sort of stands out to me is the sort of, I think different organizations are, I'll call more either security-led as they went to cloud, or they were more, kind of operationally led. And I think that sort of changed a little bit of, what were their initial priorities? How did they think about sort of what foundations they put in place? And it's funny just doing these events back to back. What's really stark is I think the Europeans are a lot more maybe risk-centric in some of their approach, which I think in some ways held them back, but also forced a more security-centric approach to maybe how cloud adoption was done there. Versus I think in a lot of places like US in particular, and I see the same thing in Australia, they were a little bit more operationally led because it was more focused on driving the innovation, and maybe a little bit risk was a bit more in the backseat. So what I tend to see is actually a lot more Terraform maturity in the Australian market relative to Vault. And it's almost the exact opposite in Europe, right? Like in Germany in particular, much more Vault maturity than maybe Terraform maturity. And it's interesting just because you can tell the attitudes were just a lot more risk-driven, data security-driven, data residency, data privacy, which is just kind of Europe very top of mind for them. Versus I think other geos were a little bit more like, how do we get the enablement and get the value of cloud and get there faster operationally? So it was more about laying the provisioning and the cloud foundation first. In the end, it converges because you can't get too far on one side without sort of the other side sort of coming into play, right? So you can only get so far in Vault before you need to automate your infrastructure. You only get so far with Terraform before you realize you have secrets everywhere. And so I think in the end, you need both of them, but that's been definitely an interesting thing, and I think it's just a cultural thing,
Yeah, nice. So I think there's definitely been a thread through, I know one of the roundtables specifically was discussing this, but certainly as I'm traveling around, one of the questions that comes up most often is all about this question of where does autonomy versus control, or autonomy versus governance sort of fit in that tension? And I'd love maybe if you could share a little bit about how you view that, and a little bit about how we tackle that even within HashiCorp.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I think one of my favorite quotes on this is, I think liberties constrain and constraints liberate. And what I mean by that is, it sounds counterintuitive, but I think the problem is if you have total liberty to do whatever you want, pick whatever tools you want, build your app however you want, deploy however you want, those liberties ultimately constrain you as an organization, because they're going to create so much operational drag day two from a governance perspective, right? And on the flip side, when you say constraints liberate, the constraints of saying I'm taking away your choice of programming language, I'm taking away your choice of CI/CD tool, I'm taking away your choice of how you're going to provision or do secret management or whatever, it liberates you to focus on the thing that actually matters, which is your application, right? And I've seen this over and over again as the organizations who are like, we're going to go fast by having no constraints or developers do whatever you want. It feels great. It's a nice idea for 90 days. Until you get to your first incident. And then you're like, what do you mean we have 500 pipelines and they have deployed Java 500 different ways? And you're like, that's exactly what I mean, right? And so I think the irony to the whole thing is when you look at these ultra high scale, ultra high performance organizations, think into Google, an Amazon, a Microsoft, a Facebook, they're ultra constrained, right? They use 2 or 3 programming languages. They have one deployment tool. They have one code management tool. They have one platform, right? So they're hyper constrained internally of how they operate, but they're at total liberty to build new applications and services and innovate at the app layer, right? And I think that's where the mistake is often made, which is, yeah, innovation is great where it matters to your business. Innovation is not great on undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? That's just a waste of time, basically.
I think I often see that, I guess, confusion that people get into where they confuse acceleration with velocity, right? And it's like you can go really fast to start with, but long-term velocity is a very, very different kind of creature. Now, jokes aside, I could probably just chat with Armon up here forever, but I'd love to probably open up to the audience, and hopefully you've got a few more questions than for the last panel, because if not, you're going to have to listen to me for a bit longer. So let's go with hands up. We'll work politely. Oh. Speed. Look at that. I love it.
A lot of vendors are talking about AI and where it fits in, and it's been fairly lacking today. You haven't said AI quite enough for the room's liking. So where do you see AI coming in for the Hashi roadmap? Is it a feature, or are you discarding it as a fad?
No, it's a good question. I know it's weird that you can have a tech conference and every other word isn't AI. It's a strange thought. The way I think about it is we sort of have 3 horizons of how I think about AI. Horizon 1 is sort of our own internal use, and how do we sort of become more efficient as a company. And there's a bunch of places we're already using it, whether it's Copilot on the R&D side, whether it's some of the stuff the support team is doing on sort of ticket escalation and ticket deflection. So there's a bunch of different places where sort of AI is being leveraged internally. Then I think there's a product-based AI approach, which is how do we enhance certain features with AI. So last HashiConf, we launched AI-generated tests for Terraform, for example. So you can actually submit a Terraform module, and we'll auto-generate Terraform tests using GPT behind the scenes. So there's features like that, and then there's a bunch of other pilot capabilities we're working on. Then being able to interact with your Terraform infrastructure, query Vault audit logs with it, have a natural language interface to Waypoint. So there's a bunch of things like that we're working on that will show up as product features and capabilities. I think the balancing act is sort of look at it as sort of a few things. One is how do you actually get the cost right on some of these things, right? Because I think when we first rolled out the Terraform test generation, I think it was $4 per click. Each time you did a test generation, it was burning that many tokens, right? And I think some of these things, you're like, okay, it's a great feature, but also you can't have a $10 a month, Terraform Cloud user spending $500 a month generating, tests. Otherwise, you have a math problem. So I think that's one piece of it, is how do you balance that? I think the second piece is we're super conscious on I'll call it the sort of, what we see with a lot of these AI-driven things is sort of the 90-10 rule. It makes you it auto-generates 90% of it correctly, but the last 10% is what takes 90% of your time to figure out, right? Because it's it'll be right enough that it looks correct, but it's wrong enough that it doesn't work. And debugging why it doesn't work takes you more time than if you just did it from the beginning, right? So I think with something like Terraform test generation, that's a perfect use case, because it's okay if it's 90% right. The last 10% doesn't matter because it's a test, right? So it's not going to break things. On things like Terraform code generation, 90% right is okay unless that last 10% was a security vulnerability, in which case it was very not okay. So getting those balances right, I think, has been difficult with just where the current generation of tech is. So I think it's going to play a big role. I do think the hype cycle is maybe, a few miles ahead of where the technology is in most cases. But that's not to say that it's not going to play a valuable role in time. I think then the third horizon to me is how do you enable customer usage of AI? So that's where we've been working on things like landing zone patterns with things like Terraform. So it's like, hey, you're going to Amazon and you want SageMaker and Bedrock and a Jupyter Notebook and things like that. Here's a Terraform thing so you can spin up your environment more quickly. So I think that's more of an end user case. Things like Vault for doing tokenization of data. So if you're training the models, you're feeding the data in fundamentally. You don't want it to memorize sensitive customer data. So you can kind of tokenize it in advance before it goes in. Or you can use tokens for other things like RAG and augmented search, things like that. So I think Vault can be used as sort of a data tokenization layer there before as part of sort of training pipelines and other things like that. So that's kind of the third horizon, which is how do you enable customer AI use cases as well. So that's kind of how I think about it. There's the three horizons. But yeah, trying to avoid every other word being that. But we'll see. Soon we're just going to put Watson X in front of all of our product names. So.
All right. Next hand.
I think I'm right in picking this up, that you were saying, obviously you speak to a lot of customers around the world, lots of good experience and understanding the journey they've been on. As a customer, how do I leverage that? I think you're changing your professional services engagements and ways of working. So what's happening in this space and how can we leverage that knowledge?
Super good question. So I think there's a few ways we're trying to kind of institutionalize what we've learned and kind of make that repeatable for our customers so that you don't have to sort of stub your toes on the same things. So the first one is we're rolling out what we call sort of maturity assessments. So this is sort of based on our learnings of saying sort of, okay, what's the good, bad, and ugly of how people have been on these journeys? And then can we sort of map that into a maturity curve to say, hey, where are you on your infrastructure lifecycle? Where are you on your secret lifecycle? Where are you on, thinking about these different things? And so we can tell you, okay, we think based on this assessment, you're sort of at phase 2. Here's what we think you should do to get to phase 3, 4, 5 from a maturity curve. So those are tools that we've now rolled out to our field. So we'd be happy to engage in that and sort of help you with those. They're kind of self-answer questionnaires, which then will map you in. And then from there, we have sort of a prescriptive view of how you should progress through it. So that's piece 1. Piece 2 is taking our own products. We've sort of worked on reference architectures of how they should be built, deployed, integrated into an environment. We call those HVDs, or HashiCorp Validated Design. So think of them as kind of reference architecture effectively. So it's our best practice saying, hey, you're deploying Terraform. Here's how it should be deployed. Here's how we think you should configure it. Here's how you should do self-service. Here's the things you should be monitoring, upgrade guides, backups, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these are almost like 100-plus page PDFs. And those include things like Terraform code and Ansible code to actually set up and configure and deploy. So it's really packaging up what we've learned of how do you do a Vault deploy at large scale multi-data center. Here's the reference architecture for that. So that's kind of piece 2 of that. And then we're actually using those to train our services partners as well. So our services partners are getting now certified on those reference designs as well. And so they get those as enabling materials. So whether it's you're working with us directly or through one of our partners, they can actually say, okay, here's the reference design from HashiCorp. We can come implement this for you and then customize the last 5% to your environment and run a maturity assessment and then sort of help you build a roadmap around, okay, you're at phase 2, 3, or whatever it is. How do we go from there? So that's a little bit of how we're trying to almost take the patterns from, I don't know, we work with thousands of enterprise customers, but the patterns end up being very much the same of okay, can we map them in and make it a bit more of a predictable journey as to how to get there? Yeah, great question.
Hey, what's your advice for organizations that are heavy users of privilege access, generic accounts, and trying to move towards short-lived credentials, role-based approvals? What's your top tips for accelerating that journey?
Oh, good question. So I think it's a few things. I think for me, I take it as sort of like I almost look at it as like a risk-based roadmap, right? Because it's like if you say there's, 5,000 different credentials in the environment, are they all equal priority? I think no, right? So to me, I look at it and say, okay, what's the crown jewel? It tends to be your data, right? Customer data tends to be number 1. So I almost look at it starting there and kind of radiating out what the priority is. So I think for most users, the highest value bang for the buck is you start with the data stores, right? So if you look at those and say, okay, I'm going to prioritize my core, service accounts for my Oracle database, right? Those are the crown jewel of losing those things gets you to my customer data first. So I almost start there and say, okay, can I start with service accounts, particularly because they tend to be static, database credentials tend to be hard-coded, and rotation tends to be hard. So I think the value of doing those first is the highest. Then the next ring to me tends to be some of the internal certificates. And the reason I think those ones are particularly thorny is they generally have no remediation strategy, What I mean by that is if you're generating if your Oracle service account got leaked, you could go to Oracle and rotate that thing or delete that username and password. If you have a 5-year, 10-year signed certificate and you leak it, good luck. I've maybe can count on one finger the number of organizations that have a reasonable revocation strategy for certificates. For most people, they've never tested revocation. They don't have a certificate revocation list that they're maintaining. So if that certificate was ever leaked or lost, it's basically valid for the next 10 years, and an attacker can use it, and there's no rotation and revocation. So when I think about it from a risk perspective, to me, that's the next ring beyond the database. Is like, okay, how do I move away from 5 to 10 year certificates down to ideally short-lived, right? Like HashiCorp, we operate at like sort of 3-day certificates as our average. So that, okay, if it's lost, I can monitor for 3 days, but I'm not worried that it's valid for 10 years. But ideally, I can get into I'm just auto-rotating those certs all the time. So I'd say start with database because they're crown jewel. Move to PKI because revocation is terrible on those things, and then ring 3 is almost, I'd say, the cloud credentials themselves. I think a very common set of breaches is someone has an Amazon key, they leave the company, they still have an Amazon key, right? And now they can be exfiltrating data from S3 or launching infrastructure that then allows them to get onto the network. So I think about those as sort of the next tier of being pretty highly privileged. And those have really good answers in terms of being able to do the identity federation, move to short-lived credentials, things like that. So that's how I'd create a priority roadmap, and then you sort of chip away at it, right? You're going to have this long tail of things, but once you get through those first 3 rings, that's a dramatic reduction in what your risk surface area looks like, and then you can sort of just chip away at it gradually. That's how I think about it. Yeah. I'm feeling like it's a happy hour mood in here.
What do you think is the biggest problem space in infrastructure and security automation that HashiCorp hasn't yet approached?
Ooh, that's an interesting question that we haven't approached. That's interesting. I mean, I think there's a bunch of different gaps, obviously, that we work with a bunch of other vendors, right? I think the pattern that we've seen emerge in the picture I used in the opening keynote was, if I think about it as like, what are the core pillars of a platform? I think it's application lifecycle. By and large, it's GitHub and GitLab that are sort of the key vendors in that space. Then it's infrastructure lifecycle. I think in that category, the biggest gap HashiCorp's always had was config management, right? We never had a configuration management tool. Customers always pressured us to do configuration management. So we always debated, should we build a tool and get in that space? Happily, Ansible is a great configuration management tool, and I think sort of rounds it out. So I think the combination of Terraform and Ansible then we'll sort of fill those gaps. And then I think, obviously we'll have, Packer at image building, Terraform and Ansible sort of config management provisioning, and Waypoint as I think about sort of the provisioning, the internal developer portal on top. So that's kind of the infrastructure one. Within the security side, I think there's a bunch of different pieces, right? I think detection was always, a missing piece, so we bought Blue Bracket, right? Historically, we never did the sort of secret scanning inventory, so that was always missing for us. Then we do the vaulting. PAM was another big gap, which is why we built Boundary. I think the other big pieces that we don't really do is data posture. And I think IBM actually does do that. They have their Guardium suite of different data posture, data loss management, things like that. So that's a whole suite within the security lifecycle that we've never historically touched, was the data side of things. And then I think on monitoring, you have sort of app level monitoring, so Datadog, New Relic, things like that. That's always been a space we've never been in. I think we just partner with them. There's a lot of depth in the observability world and lots of established solutions there, Splunk, et cetera. And then security is its own universe, the CSPMs. So whether it's Wiz or Palo Alto or something else, I think that's another world. And again, we just partnered there. So I think, in some sense, the kind of control points of these platforms have become pretty clear. And I think, some of these are just very entrenched markets. Like, we're never going to go build a GitHub. We're never going to go build a Datadog. But I think it's on the adjacencies to some of the core products where we've had gaps around config management, PAM, things like that we've been sort of investing in. And then now through the acquisition, I think we'll have better answers in some of those categories. Yeah, good question. The good thing is, in some sense, the problem space is more well-defined now than it was. Like 10 years ago, if you asked me the same question, it was sort of like, we don't know. Because it's kind of like it's not clear what the control points are. And I think over the last 10, 15 years, you see it sort of a convergence onto those, maybe very relatively clear 4 pillars in terms of how we think about the lifecycle management. So I think now it's just the landscape is better understood, and you're seeing sort of a consolidation of vendors in these different spaces, right? What used to be 15 different point products across that is really converged into a handful of core vendors. And I think it'll continue to converge, honestly.
Rather controversial. The license change you guys went through. Is there anything to tell us a bit more about that? What's been the reception? Any lessons or something you would give for other people who have their own startup that's become ridiculously successful? Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
It was so fun that I had a lobotomy so that I don't have to think about that pyramid anymore. So, maybe I'll rewind and give the context. So obviously we're a very open source company, have been since the beginning. Everything was very liberally licensed under Mozilla Public License forever. I think the challenge and sort of the pattern we saw and many of our peers that we speak to who are open source companies saw is, when you're a small enough company, you just launched Terraform, nobody cares. You have 0 users, it doesn't matter. It's just you who think it's a great idea. But at some point, you sort of flash forward years later and you've created large markets, right? At some point, HashiCorp was, today we're at, 600 million a year in revenue. So you've created a large market around Vault, around Terraform, around these things. And so somewhere along the way, people realize hey, this thing is great. HashiCorp's built all this IP. They've built all these cool products. They put on these great conferences and do all the DevRel and marketing. And they've built these communities. Why don't we just take their work and sell it? Because there's no barrier for us to do so. Right? And so there's this sort of interesting paradox that sits at the heart of open source, which is what allowed you to build those communities also means there's no barrier to entry for someone else to come in and basically do that. And so what we saw happen over the last few years was exactly that. VMware wrapped Terraform in Vault and packaged it with their stuff. IBM, in fact, did the same thing with multiple products. A bunch of startups, their whole thesis was basically put a UI on top of the HashiCorp stuff, sell it for 50 cents on the dollar, and then pitch the company to be sold to HashiCorp, which was a unique thing, right? Their investors are like, you should buy this company. You're like, why? They're like, and literally they're like, because they're just going to be a thorn in your side. So you're like, that's their whole business model. So we sort of saw this behavior and you're like, okay, well, this is only going to get worse as your market goes from 500 million to $1 billion. There's even more economic incentive to do the same thing. So there's really only 2 paths. Option 1 is you say, I stop doing R&D for my competitors because I'm just going to put all of my development into enterprise. I'm just not going to do anything in community anymore, right? And so therefore my competitors are forced to actually do their own R&D rather than just expecting me to do it. Or I'm going to change my license to basically says you're free to use the products however you want if you're an end user. But if you're a commercial vendor, you can't sell my software against me, right? And so when you sort of look at it rationally, say those are kind of your third choice is do nothing and continue to do free R&D for your competition. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because at some point your problem is VMware and IBM have a much bigger sales force than we do, right? So it's like, okay, I have 300 sellers, they have 30,000 combined. We're not going to win that fight, right? Especially if we were doing the R&D and they're doing the selling. It's not a good combo. So rationally, that's not really an option. And I think you see this problem for every one of the big open source vendors, right? You saw Mongo go through it. You saw Redis go through it. You saw Confluent go through it. So pretty much everyone has kind of gone through that. And I think the counterpoints most people bring up are startups that are at $10, $20 million in revenue. We're like, well, yeah, because they're so small that IBM and VMware don't care. Talk to me when you get to 200 million and they've packaged you up and sell you as part of VMware, and then you'll be doing a license change too. So I think that's the reality is there's this economic problem at the heart of open source. So, in some sense, my biggest lesson, if I could do all of it again, is I would have started with a license like BSL so that I never had to do a license change. And we work with a lot of early stage startups that's what they're doing, right? And you're seeing a shift in the whole open source ecosystem now, where these other licenses are being normalized because people are understanding there's a fundamental dynamics problem at play here, right? Now, I think the other side of it was when we went through the license change, there was obviously a fork of multiple of our products, and I think the companies behind those forks spread a lot of FUD, right? So their messaging was very altruistic, we're here for the community, we're kumbaya, okay, that's all great. But the reality when you clicked one level deeper was, okay, but all of these were companies who were taking our product and selling them commercially against us. And some of them even had the audacity to come to HashiConf and have booths, which was truly something else. So, I think when you click in, you're like, yeah, it's community on the tin, but really what happened is we put a nail in their business model, and they really had two options, which was close the door or do a fork. And so, they took the high ground of spreading a bunch of lies and saying, oh, well, now everyone has to pay HashiCorp and, big bad evil HashiCorp or whatever. Versus the reality was, hey, we were mooching off of their free R&D and they told us to stop, and we don't like that, right? Which was, the reality of the situation, right? So I think that's kind of the nuances that went into it. Obviously, some of that stuff is harder to say publicly in quite that way. But I think that was it. At the end of it, the day, it's like if we weren't in that situation, then great. We would have loved to continue to keep the license exactly where they were. The reality of the market was that wasn't really a practical option, right? Given that you have, the market dynamics that you did. I think by going to this sort of license model, there's really maybe a dozen companies on the planet that were impacted by our license. Where it's like, okay, I'm sorry for you. You have to do your own R&D. Sad. Welcome to every other company, right? But it doesn't impact our end users. They continue to get to use it and freely use it and extend it and do whatever they want. So that's great. It preserved the community ethos. Versus, I think if we went the other way and said put everything into enterprise, basically stop doing community, I think that would have been way more difficult culturally for our entire community and user base, right? So to me, it was the more pragmatic option of sort of solving for the reality. Yeah, hope that helps.
Look, on behalf of everyone, I just want to say thanks, Armon, for taking the time, for taking those questions. I'm sure that people are probably going to come up and ask the questions that they weren't sort of confident to ask in front of everybody very shortly. But wait until you get to drink, all right, or two.